Doesn't matter you.
Yeah, I can. I know. Great.
Okay. Okay, so Dominic, you may proceed.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our final Pride event for the year 2026. And of course, happy Pride. Now, please allow me to introduce our facilitator, Glenroy Murray. Glenroy Murray is a social justice and human rights advocate with specific focus on LGBTQ+ rights in Jamaica. He is the Executive Director and Equality for All Foundation and the Senior Associate for the Caribbean at Human Dignity Trust. He is a 2018 Chevening Scholar and a 2022 nominee for the Prime Minister's Youth Award for Excellence, a published academic writer and researcher, and serves on multiple regional boards for LGBTQ+ rights. He tutors constitutional law at UWI Mona. Everyone, please give a round of applause for Glenroy.
I'll imagine the applause. But thank you so much, Dominic, for that introduction. I've been asked, and I just want to confirm that. Okay, seeing them coming in now. I just want to confirm that everyone is hearing me. So a thumbs up would be good, or just a quick yes in the chat. Yeah, great. All right, so thanks for inviting me, Joshua, and Irau's team and community overall. I see a raised hand, but I think it's meant to be a thumbs up. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on something that I have a particular interest in over the last, I would like to say 5 to 10 years, which is economic, social, and cultural rights, and we've added in environmental rights as well. And so what I will be doing in the presentation that I'm about to share is talking about what those rights are, in terms of the international human rights law understanding of those rights, but also what the reality is within the Caribbean context in terms of how our governments have treated those rights, and engender a conversation about what the implication of that reality is for us in the Caribbean as LGBTQIA plus people who ought to be benefiting from the guarantees of these rights, but in a situation where they're not 100% or at all guaranteed in some of our countries. And so I'd love to, for the presentation, I just love for everyone to be active and be involved in the discussion as we talk about the implications of this, and both for the communities that we are a part of and serve, but also for the work that would need to be done going forward in light of those realities. So I'm going to share my screen now and start. It's heavy on the law and the legalities a little bit, but I'll make sure my language is accessible, and anybody who has any questions throughout the course of it, you can put it in the chat and I will get back to it. So I just like for persons to confirm that they're seeing my screen. I see a thumb up. Great. All right. So yeah. So as I said, we'll be talking about economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights of LGBTQIA plus people in the Caribbean. And so let's just jump right into it. So I start by the conversation of what human rights are, just as a baseline. As some of us, or most of us should know, human rights are the entitlements that we have because we're human beings. So it's very tied to the fact that we're alive as human beings, that we are entitled to a baseline of treatment. And what that really means is that our governments are required to not treat us below these standards, and human rights are standards of how we're supposed to be treated by our government. Our government are not supposed to treat us below these standards. because they recognize that we are human beings and we're entitled to be treated in a particular way just by virtue of being human beings. And so human rights generally creates obligations on the government not only to respect us as people, but also to protect our rights. And so that means they have to take additional steps to make sure that our rights are protected and fulfill our rights, which also means that the government can't just sit back and say, oh, well, I pass a law and the law says the right is not there. It must mean something. So for example, if you have the right to life, and so if someone in your, or all of us have the right to life, and so if someone you know in the community has been attacked and unfortunately has lost their life, then the government has a responsibility, even though they weren't the ones that did the killing, they have a responsibility to make sure that that murder is investigated and that it is prosecuted, which is how they protect the right. And then they have to put steps in place to prevent certain things from happening again. So maybe additional laws need to be passed, maybe hate crime legislation need to be passed, maybe programs aimed at disputes resolution and conflict resolution needs to be rolled out. So those are all about affirming your right to life. So not only do they have to respect it and protect it with laws, but put things in place to make sure that we all understand as a society that the right to life exists and deserves protection. Now, oftentimes when we talk about human rights, we talk about one set or mostly one set. And so it's important that we understand that there are different categories of rights. And a lot of these categories, to be very honest, come from discussions that were happening at the time when certain international documents were being developed. So the first generation of rights are considered your civil and political rights. And examples of that, which I'll share later, but one of the examples is like freedom of expression and freedom of movement. So these are the rights that you have as an individual to be able to participate in public life. You should be able to speak freely, including criticize your government. You should be able to go about your business undisturbed. And so these were the rights that certain countries in the 1940s and the 1960s, so in the post-World War era when the UN had just started, they were interested in protecting these rights. So in your liberal democracies like US, UK, Canada, they're interested in protecting civil and political rights. That matters to them. The ability to have representation, seek office, speak up when you think something has gone wrong. And so in certain other countries, these weren't a priority. But civil and political rights are understood as a common set of rights that are acknowledged and respected. But then you have another set, which largely forms the conversation today, which is economic, social, and cultural rights. So whereas civil and political rights are those rights that you have as an individual to go about your life, and the state shouldn't intervene in your life in a particular way, like the right to privacy, freedom from detention, those kinds of things, freedom from discrimination. Economic, social, and cultural rights are those rights that acknowledge that as a human being, you have basic needs, including the right to healthcare, the right to an adequate standard of living, which includes food and shelter. And so these were the rights that are very intrinsically tied to, as a human being, able to survive. And it was recognized that a state does have an obligation to provide for those rights as well. However, there was a split in and around the 1940s and then leading up to the 1960s in the early days of the UN's formation. So on one side of the world, liberal democracies, as they call them, there's this priority on protecting things like expression and freedom of assembly and association, but they weren't necessarily keen on guaranteeing people food and shelter, as capitalism does. But then on the other side of the world, in countries that were more socialist and communist leaning, they weren't particularly keen on facilitating things like freedom of expression and so on, but they were interested in providing for people's, oh, I'm looking at the wrong thing. They were interested in providing for people's basic needs. So right to healthcare, right to work, right to shelter. So the government providing and spending for these services makes sense in a country that believes in a controlled economy, because the government have all the resources to dish out. versus a liberal democracy where the government doesn't feel like it needs to have all the resources and market forces should provide for everything. So there was this divide in the early days of the UN. So when they originally were trying to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, originally what it was meant to be was a big international treaty on human rights. But nobody could agree because they had diverse representation, both from the liberal democracies and the communist countries. And so they could never agree beyond coming up with a universal declaration, which was at the time a non-binding document, really just a declaration of principles. It's like how in government, where our governments just have policy statements and so on, but if whether or not they actually implement those policies, is not necessarily guaranteed. In the international law sense, declarations are guiding principles, but they don't have the force of law in the way that treaties are supposed to. And so, because they couldn't agree on all the rights that needed to be protected, there was a split. On the one hand, you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the other hand, you have the International Covenant on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which were later passed in the mid-60s, in 1966. So those rights were kind of dealt with separately within international human rights law for years and years, until and still continues to be in terms of them having different treaties, but no, because both of those sets of rights exist within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All countries technically are bound by all types of rights, both the civil and political rights and the economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, the third generation of rights I would still say modern, even though it's been modern for a while now, but relative to the others that we're talking about, it's a newer generation of rights that are being acknowledged that, yes, human rights are primarily individual rights, but they're also collective forms of rights. So, for example, the rights of indigenous people to recognition, the rights of them to their form of land ownership, the right to a healthy environment, the right to truth, the right to development, the right to self-determination. These are all the collective rights of a people. And while international human rights law has been slow to formally acknowledge these rights in treaties, then it's definitely emerged in some of the resolutions and the documents that have developed within the international human rights law space. And even in, for example, the Inter-American system that we're a part of, there is a recognition of the rights of indigenous people to own land in their specific ways, for example. So that's where a conversation about the right to a healthy environment comes from, because no one person owns the environment. It's for the benefit of all of us. So it's a collective right, but it's a human right that is slowly being acknowledged in this modern era. And I say very slowly because we know that climate change, unfortunately, is not something every nation, every government takes seriously, and some people just straight up deny it. So those are the kind of main generations of rights. Oh, for the moment, let me changing. So, as I said, we talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a non-binding agreement. It really set the stage for the major international human rights law treaties that came next. They really tried to recognize all of those rights originally because while they couldn't agree on making them binding, they wanted to list them. So the right to life is there, freedom from discrimination is there as civil and political rights, but there's also the right to work and the right to health. And then in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, your classic, understanding of rights is there. So right to liberty and security of the person, so people shouldn't detain you or physically assault you, for example, freedom of movement, freedom of your expression, equality before the law, so the law shouldn't discriminate against you. You should be treated fairly by the courts. There are other things like freedom of assembly, so you should be able to gather and associate. Those are all things that are covered under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, that's when we start to get into basic needs. So, for example, the right to work, the right to healthcare, the right to social security, the right to education, things that are going to address our basic needs, those are covered under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So altogether, these three documents are considered the International Bill of Human Rights. But the interesting thing is, globally, not everybody has ratified all, both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Good thing is that in the Caribbean, most of our countries have ratified both. But the reality is that that's not necessarily the case. So not all of us, unfortunately, are bound by these same set of principles, but it's there. So I wanted to talk about the ratification status within the Commonwealth Caribbean of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And the reason why I wanted to do this is that, yes, while we acknowledge that these are globally recognized principles within human rights that have been guaranteed and acknowledged, not all countries actually have chosen to be bound by them. And so that what that means for their citizens is a bit complicated, because while, yes, there's this kind of general understanding, and the Universal Declaration generally is now considered binding as a form of long-standing international law, there's still very little you can use to force countries to implement these, especially a country that does not even ratify the treaty. Because when you ratify the treaty, what happens is that there's a thing called a treaty body, and each of the major international human rights treaties have a treaty body, which is a group of experts on human rights that come together and they explain what the right means and determine whether or not a country has fulfill their obligation, or if they fail to fulfill their obligation. And in some instances, if the country allows it, individuals from a specific country can go to the treaty body and make complaints about their rights being violated. And so, for example, there was a time when a few countries in the Caribbean were able to use what they call the optional protocol to make complaints of our states that violated our civil and political rights. And a lot of them were death penalty cases back in the day. But many of the Caribbean countries kind of say, no more. We're tired of UNRWA bringing me in front of these bodies. And so they kind of closed off that opportunity. There's a lot of history there. But all that to say, most of the countries within the Commonwealth Caribbean, and by the way, the reason why I'm looking at the Commonwealth Caribbean is twofold. One, the rules are different in countries, for example, like Dominican Republic and Cuba, where how international law relates to them is different. So in most of the Commonwealth Caribbean, we are dualist countries, which means that international law is not directly applicable in our countries. It's more of a guiding principle, recommendations, those kinds of things. And so for those international human rights principles to take effect as law in our country, a law actually has to be passed. It's a little bit different in countries within Latin America, for example, where a lot of them are monist countries. And so they are directly applicable once the treaty is ratified. And then the other part of it, the reason why I didn't look at the overseas territories, I only looked at the independent countries, is because their ratification technically is up to the UK specifically. And so it would be difficult to kind of assess those obligations when the UK is really their overarching decision maker, and they're the ones that can pass laws for them and so on. And so I decided to focus on the independent Commonwealth Caribbean countries because of that. But as I said, most countries ratified. Barbados ratified the earliest, even though technically Jamaica signed before them, but they ratified later in 75. And then some countries like St. Kitts ratified as recent as 2 years ago in 2024, less than 2 years ago. And St. Lucia is the only country that has not ratified or acceded to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So unfortunately for our St. Lucian siblings, technically, y'all do not have anything that recognizes these rights beyond the general view within international human rights law, which might be a source of advocacy for, St. Lucian foreign policy and so on, international human rights policy. So, oh yes, I saw a question. What does ratified mean? So ratify means that the country agrees to be bound by the treaty. So the country can actually sign it sign the treaty when it's kind of developing. But when you ratify or accede to a treaty, it's a process by which you sign something that says, this treaty applies to me and my country. And so the state has to go in and says, yes, we agree to be bound by this treaty, because treaties are international law contracts. And so that's basically you saying the contract has a certain effect. And so, yeah, that's what that means. My apologies for not clarifying before. So let's get into some guiding principles about economic, social, and cultural rights, because they're a little bit different than the civil and political rights. A lot of the times with civil and political rights, like say freedom of speech, the main thing that the government really has to do is nothing. As long as they, not in all cases, but in most cases, as long as they don't do anything to stop you from having free speech or punish you for having free speech, then the right has been, recognized. Of course, there are additional things that they would need to do. So in some instances, like passing access to information legislation so that people have access to information, because that kind of is, freedom of information kind of falls within that. How they manage their defamation laws is important about recognizing that, right? But those are those kinds of things. So generally, when it comes down to civil and political rights, all the government has to do is leave people alone and respect their ability to do certain things or say certain things. That is not necessarily the case with economic, social, and cultural rights, because that's because of the nature of them. For example, the right to education means nothing if no school don't build, right? And so for a government to actually meet these rights, there's some guiding principles that matter. So it wasn't just signing on and not doing anything like in civil and political rights. It was signing on with an understanding that to fulfill these rights, there are actions that need to take. So in Article 2, the states agree to take steps, whether by themselves or through international assistance and cooperation, to use their maximum available resources to achieve progressively the full realization of the rights, and by all appropriate means. And so what that means is they're gonna do what they can with what they have, so that over time they can make sure that the rights are fully recognized and fully realized, and people have the full benefit of the rights. So I go into some of the elements of this shortly, but just to say, it recognizes that all countries aren't made equal. Some countries have more money than others. So providing for the right to health, which invariably means building hospitals and health centers and a health system, might be easier for a richer country to do, like a Canada, and it can have like proper insurance coverage for everybody nationally. They don't, but for example, whereas for countries in our region with smaller economies, how we get to where they are is going to take time. And so they have the principle of, for example, progressive realization. So that means that the states have to continuously take steps to get there, right? It's not that, oh, you fail because you didn't do anything, or what you did wasn't enough. It's recognizing, say, okay, maybe you'll build one hospital, and maybe you'll build the capacity of healthcare workers in that hospital for the first 2 years, and then you build another in the next 2 years, and you get better equipment, you get better medical education systems, that kind of thing. Is the state acknowledges that it has to continuously improve things, and not take any retrograde steps to kind of remove like certain key healthcare services or make them less accessible. So it acknowledges that certain things take time. And so if the states are continuously trying to make things better, then they're meeting the obligation. So maximum available resources means that every state has something, right? Some states don't have the same as others, but if some have $5, some have $10. So for the ones that have $5, you maybe can only use 2 to deal with healthcare. Use the full 2 rather than less and not meet the obligation. So it creates a relativity within states to kind of acknowledge what they have and use what they have to the best, to get the best possible result. And then there's the idea of minimum core obligations. I go into the example for a couple, but not all of them that we're discussing today for time. But minimum core obligations means that even if the country is dirt poor, there's certain minimum elements of each right that a state can do to meet some level of an obligation. So there's essential elements of what it means to guarantee the right, right? So it assumes that each right should be realized to the extent that it provides for the basic needs of every member of society. So it's usually a legal minimum standard, and usually it's not necessarily something that has a high cost on it. Maybe it's passing a law, maybe it's ensuring there's no discrimination in service provision or making steps to ensure that. But there's just certain things that for each right, you have to do at least this thing, or else you're not meeting the obligation. So that also recognizes that, you know, everybody doesn't start at the same place, but there's just certain things everybody has to do. And then there's the idea of taking into immediate effect. So they have the duty to take steps or adopt measures directed towards a full realization, and prohibiting discrimination, for example, in service delivery, is something that would have immediate effect. So taking steps, you have to do immediately. You won't get to the goal, but you start. So starting, prohibiting discrimination are certain things you have to do with immediate effect, to ensure that the rights mean something. And just to note, when we talk about protecting against discrimination in this context about economic, social, and cultural rights, we're talking about making sure that in accessing these basic goods, no discrimination is happening that would make accessing it for certain groups not a reality. So for example, let's use education. If you have rules against girls going to school, like some countries do have or have had, then the discrimination means that there's no right to education for girls. And so removing those kind of discriminatory rules is something you have to do immediately so you can begin to meet the core obligations for the right to education. So we're going to start with the right to health. Just to check, I don't think there are any. Yeah. And so for the right to health, it contains freedoms and entitlements. The freedoms include the right to be able to control one's health and body, including sexual and reproductive freedom, and the freedom from interference. You shouldn't be subjected to torture, non-consensual medical treatment, or experimentation. So, and the right to health is the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health and well-being, right? You're also entitled to a system of health protection which provides equality of opportunity to the highest attainable level of health, right? And so it's not just being able to go to the doctor and, you know, get medication. It's also about an entire system that reduces your risks to health complications and health issues, but also provides for your needs in a broad way. So it's an inclusive right. So it's not just about medical care, but it's also about addressing, as I said, social determinants of health. So for that right to mean something, you're supposed to have an adequate supply of safe food. So for example, is your country passing laws about food standards, how food should be prepared, how food should be stored? Are those type of public health sanitation laws passed, and are they enforced? Because that is going to affect your right to health if people can sell anything as food in any way. Adequate nutrition and housing. So, you know, is there adequate labeling of things? Are there laws that govern that? Healthy occupational and environmental conditions, because, you know, if you're not in healthy circumstances, you will become sick. Are there laws that deal with that, about how garbage and sanitation and how all that, and sewage and managing all of that? And then access to health information, including sexual and reproductive health. And of course, healthcare should be free from discrimination. So those are some of the elements of what the highest attainable, the right to the highest attainable standard of health. You have to not only make sure that there are hospitals, but that healthcare holistically is being looked at. And healthcare doesn't just look at, you know, what's happening in a hospital, it's all the things that will get you sick. So it involves, for example, how different governments in different ways was managing pandemics and things like that, how they're making sure that there is supply chain management of medication for certain chronic illnesses, Those kinds of things are tied up in your right to health. And then there's a set of broad policy objectives. So the committee here refers to the treaty body that deals with the Treaty on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So they're saying that healthcare needs to be available. So the service must exist, accessible, so it shouldn't be too far, too hard to reach, should be of good quality, and it must be culturally and otherwise acceptable to the persons receiving it. So that gets into issues related to consent and cultural sensitivities and all of that, and the ways in which service is delivered. And so within even questions of accessibility is issues related to non-discrimination, availability, for example. We can get into some of the examples for like queer people. Are there services for trans people in your country in terms of if they want to do gender affirming care, you know? Those kinds of conversations you need to have. What are the access to sexual health and reproductive health services? Is the government doing enough to make sure that either there's a market for, or there is within public health services, certain sexual and reproductive health items, or especially when we're looking at sexual and reproductive health needs for queer women. So for people who do not have phallic sex or sex with men, are different types of barrier methods available within the public health system, or just in the private, or is that facilitated in the private health system? So those are the kinds of things that are going to end up impacting your right to health, and not providing that will produce adverse health outcomes, because if there's limited ways for queer women to protect themselves sexually, if trans people don't have access to drugs, they might be put in compromised position. If sexual health information isn't available, it's gonna have an impact on, you know, prevalence of certain STIs and so on. If medication isn't available for chronic illnesses like diabetes and other non-communicable diseases, what does that look like? So your right to health encompasses all of that. And some of the core obligations are, you need to be able to access health facilities in ways that are non-discriminatory, and they need to be like minimum essential food that is adequate, that people in the society are able to access. So because you want to prevent hunger. There should be access to basic shelter and housing. The essential drugs should be provided. An equitable distribution of health facilities. So if you only have two, make sure they're not all near to each other. So people on the furthest side of your island has to travel hours and hours to get there. So those are some of the kinds of things. And then having a national public health strategy and plan of action. So before I go over to the right to work, because you know, there's a lot to be covered here. Are there any questions?
I have one.
Sure, go ahead, Caleb.
When the state fails to meet its obligation, specifically, when a person experiences violence and the state fails to investigate, as far as you know, what are the options for ordinary person to ensure that the state meets its obligations?
Okay. We can talk about it some more later in the discussion segment, but the options for people depends on what your country recognizes. So if the right in person, so for example, some countries in the region do recognize the right to work, then your options depend on what are your pathways in country and outside of country. In country pathways could be constitutional challenges, which are expensive, complicated. It could be that there is a body in your country, whether it's a national human rights institution or something like an ombudsman's office, or some other parliamentary commission that is there to provide oversight to what is happening within the state. In some instances, if your parliament is actually doing what they're supposed to do, there should be mechanisms for citizens to be able to raise these issues, whether through writing to the different subcommittees of parliament that review those kinds of things. So those are some options, but a lot of times these rights aren't recognized, right? And outside of lobbying to get improvements in individual cases or filing complaints to internal complaint systems, you begin to look at what the international mechanisms are if the right is not even recognized. And so you can look at things like, do you need to get a precautionary measure from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights so that they can raise awareness of the issue and embarrass the country a little so they take it seriously? Should you be raising this through different treaty body or treaty body mechanisms like shadow reports, or should you be making sure that you're collecting the data and the evidence and the stories to share with your bilateral partners if your country's universal periodic review is coming up? And for those who don't know, the Universal Periodic Review is a space where countries review each other's human rights record. And so what some advocates do is reach out to missions and other countries and different representatives from different countries to make sure that their issues are raised to their country's officials when they are being reviewed. So those are some of like the bigger international human rights options, but I often think the closer to home, the better. How can you raise awareness about this at a local and national level so that you can get a quicker response, even if there isn't a recognition of the right, so to speak? There are ways in which awareness can be raised. Let me use an example. So in Jamaica, we have the National Health Fund, and for a while it didn't cover certain chronic illnesses like a specific heart condition. And what one advocate did, who did suffer from that heart condition, was kind of write to the Prime Minister, engage the Prime Minister and the Health Minister on social media, and did personal advocacy until it was covered under the NHF. So the right to health for her was being infringed because her chronic condition wasn't covered under the program. But then through her advocacy, she got that not just for herself, but people for other who had similar chronic conditions. So those are some of like the advocacy-based responses that you can do, particularly when it comes down to something like the right to health that is, for example, in Jamaica, not recognized in our constitution. There's still opportunities to push for what the right to health should mean. So yeah, that would be my options. If there's a formal complaint mechanism nationally, use that. You could bring international attention to it, but if you can lobby directly decision makers and make noise in the media to bring attention to it, do that as well. And I do that first.
Noted, but you're making the point for me that while personal advocacy has value, for those of people living in the closet, that is not a standard reaction when they need something, unfortunately. And I struggle personally to figure out what do you do with something like that. They need something, but they won't speak up.
I get you, and I empathize in a lot of ways. I face similar things here in Jamaica. People might want to change, but they're not willing to be the face or even pursue it personally because of fears of exposure. My suggestion would be, to the extent that you can document and use it as a broader approach to advocacy for the issues, because they might not be the only one going through it. You do that, you raise it where you can, even if they are not willing to be the face for it. Yes, Sharon. Go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
I said good night. Great presentation so far. I think in sort of to piggyback on what Caleb is saying, is that's why this highlights the importance of having on-the-ground coalitions or groups. So if I don't have the agency to bring my matter out because I'm in the closet, if we have strong grassroots organizations or community-based organizations that are able to provide support, then I wouldn't have to go up against the system. I may be able to utilize that mechanism to highlight my issue.
Sure, and I agree with you, but I don't want to not I highlight the importance because I think this is work that we're gonna have to do as queer people in our communities, that at some point we're gonna have to personally fight for our rights. Because sometimes what happens is, for example, here in Jamaica, where we fight to get a system that recognizes some level of human rights. For example, we have the diversity policy that the police have that is supposed to guide how they interact with us. The policy exists, community members have been sensitized on it. But if when that policy is violated, you don't take the report and bring it to INDICOM, and we've brought INDICOM, which is the Independent Commission of Investigations, and they investigate armed forces and their and any type of abuse of power that they do and so on. If you as a queer person don't bring that to INDICOM when it happens, and we've brought INDICOM to the community to reassure them that they take these kinds of cases, even in one instance a community member did validate that they used it, then it will just exist because yes, you can generally push for rights and you can get general solutions, but general solutions don't mean anything a lot of times in individual circumstances. And so I hear you on building those coalitions. I do think it's important, and I think it does get us to a point, but at a certain point, if my right is being violated, I have to use a channel if I want a fix for my issue, because a general advocacy push can only get a general response. But at the end of the day, the government can do the recognition and the law reform, but an individual in government can violate the right just because they're biased, right? And I have to be the one who faces it, maybe with some backing from an organization. I still have to be the one to champion my case because it's affecting me. But I don't want to get distracted into that broader conversation. So let's look at the right to work. So every individual has the right to be able to work, allowing him or her to live in dignity or them to live in dignity. The right to work contributes to the survival of the individual and also to their family. And the work should be freely chosen and accepted, and it should be for the development and it should be for the development and recognition. I mean, that's why, work should persons being able to work should manifest in those ways. So it does encompass all forms of work, whether independent work or dependent wage paid work, and it should not be understood as an absolute and unconditional right to obtain employment. It's not that you have a right to get a specific job, or it just means that there should be no restriction on your ability to work. It's the right for you to decide freely to accept and choose work, and so you shouldn't be forced into work, and you should be able to engage in employment and not be unfairly deprived of employment. So before I go to the other part, what I add to this is that there's also tied up in the right to work, the right to favorable and just conditions of work. And they're both recognized within the convention or the covenant. And so it's not just your right to work, is that when you're on the job, you should be treated unfairly, you need to get your wages, you should have enough leave and leisure time. The conditions of work should be good, it should be healthy, it should be safe, those things. So you should be able to freely choose to go into work, and when you get there, you should be treated fairly within the context of work and shouldn't be subject to discrimination. And so the work should be available, accessible, acceptable, and be of good quality. And in terms of what just and fair conditions of work look like, you should have the right to remuneration, so you shouldn't be doing forced labor for free. Your working conditions should be safe and healthy. You should have there should be an equal opportunity for everyone to be promoted, other than only looking at your seniority and competence. And of course, you should have rest, leisure, and a reasonable limitation of working hours, periodic holidays with pay, as well as remuneration for public holidays, amongst others. So should have fair conditions of work, and you should have the general right to work. So the minimum core obligation here is non-discrimination. So it includes the right to access employment, especially for disadvantaged and marginalized groups. If you think about persons living with disabilities, women in certain circumstances, LGBTQ plus people in certain circumstances, we shouldn't be denied the right to work, essentially. There shouldn't be any discriminatory treatment in public and private sectors for disadvantaged groups, and there should be national employment strategies and plans of actions to address the concerns of workers. So I'm going to swiftly move on to the right to education. After I finish going through each of the rights, I'll take I do additional round of questions. For education, everybody has a right to an education that is directed to their full development of their human personality and their sense of dignity, and that strengthens your respect for human rights and freedoms. The education should enable all persons to participate effectively in a free society. It should promote understanding and tolerance and friendship among all nations and all racial, ethnic, or religious groups. I'm going to be honest, I don't know if many countries' education curricula and programs meet this standard here, but these human rights are oftentimes the ideals of where we need to be. But sure, your education should, be aimed at your development and equip you with the necessary information. So this is what the right says in the convention, in the covenant, that primary education should be compulsory and available free to all. So that's your first thing to check. Is primary education free in your country to everyone? Secondary education in its different forms, including technical and vocational forms, should be generally available and accessible to all by every appropriate means. And it should be progressively, countries should introduce free education at the secondary level. Higher education should be made equally accessible to all, looking at capacity, and it should be progressively become free. That's the standard and the ideal here. Fundamental education should be encouraged and intensified as far as possible for those persons who have not received or completed the whole period of their primary education. So you're thinking of remedial education programs for adults who, especially at a time when education wasn't as accessible, should be benefiting from those type of programs. And then there should be a system of schools and a fellowship system, and the material conditions for teaching staff should be improved. So the idea is that, primary definitely should be free, and the rest should become progressively more accessible and free. There should be remedial education programs, and there should be a system of schools and programs for education. And then we're going to move over to the right to social security. So as I talk, just stick off in your head how far your country may or may not be from those types of ideals. So every individual does have the right to social security, and that means the right to access and maintain benefits, whether in cash or kind, without discrimination, in order to secure protection from lack of work-related income caused by sickness, disability, maternity, employment injury, unemployment, old age, or death of a family member, unaffordable access to healthcare, or insufficient family support, particularly for children and adult dependents. So essentially, and for me, the right to social security is one of the most critical economic, social, and cultural rights in my view, because there really is, it's a society needs to have safety nets for people. Those safety nets mean that if for whatever reason you've lost your job, you are harmed on the job, you got a chronic illness, maybe you're pregnant, you've become older, or the person who you were dependent on unfortunately passes, there should be a safety net that catches you and make sure that you don't fall into complete and utter ruin. You might not live well or live, high, but there should be a safety net for you. And that safety net should protect you from unaffordable. You should be able to get some level of health care, and you should be protected from, it's for protection, to secure protection from you not being able to afford healthcare. And if your family is not supporting you, there needs to be something. And I think in our countries where poverty is a significant factor in people's lived experiences, the fact that, not in all countries, but in quite a few of our countries, enough is not done to make sure those safety nets are meaningful I think it does strike at the realities. And when I think about how it impacts queer people might get kicked out of school, queer people might be displaced from their communities, queer people might lose their jobs because of their queerness. And having safety nets matter even more to communities like ours because our precarity as a community is more real, right? And when the systems don't, even let's say those systems aren't even specific to us, but when there aren't even strong social security systems, it means those of us who are more at risk for falling into ruin because of our vulnerabilities, we're going to suffer because there's nothing there to catch us, right? And we were the first ones that are going to be pushed out of the ship, but there's no lifeboat. And so that's why I think it's really critical that as a project, as queer people, we really begin to become invested in pushing for greater social security, right? Because we know what happens to our communities, our community members when they're displaced or lose their jobs or otherwise, discarded by their families. So the right to social security is understood as a vital means for ensuring an individual's subsistence. And so in securing the rights, due regard must be given to what social security means within a given context, and there shouldn't be any unreasonable restrictions of existing social security coverage, and should be guided by factors like availability, what risks you're exposed to, and contingencies need to be put in place, how adequate the safety net might be, how accessible it is, and what other rights do you have that might be impacted. But yeah, so even in countries where there are programs, are they enough? Do they actually meet the need? And what would it cost to get us there? And then I'm going to look at the right to an adequate standard of living. Which I think is the last one. We're going to talk about the environment more broadly. But the right to an adequate standard of living encompasses the right to food, the right to clothing, housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. The right to housing is one which should be seen as a right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity. So I'm zooming out the right to housing. So obviously you need to have the right to food and clothing. The right to housing, I'm zooming out because of some of the realities I just talked about for queer people and how housing and us has always been like a collective issue. It is integrally linked to other human rights, and it takes into account a variety of considerations that it should be ensured to all persons irrespective of income and access to economic resources. And so when we think about one, you need to have an adequate standard of living. So where you live needs to look a certain way, needs to meet a certain standard. There's the additional idea that all persons should have somewhere they can go and be housed in, even if it's not one that they own. And so another form of social safety nets, if it's not just like the in-kind contributions, when people lose their income, it's also where do we put our homeless and our temporarily displaced and our unhoused? Where are we putting these people? And do we have enough programs in place for those people who have been displaced? Or do we just leave them to the elements, particularly in cultures and countries and contexts where hurricanes are a yearly reality? What are the systems in place? And the fact that our countries have signed on to this treaty, most of us except St. Lucia, means then we should really be also considering what is in place, and is it enough? Is it adequate for our communities? And even if they do have something in place, do our community members feel safe in these spaces? So as articulated by the committee, adequacy in terms of how adequate the provision of the standard of living is determined by a range of factors. There's a belief that it is nevertheless impossible to identify certain aspects. Sorry, it's nevertheless possible to identify certain aspects. Right. So some of the things they look at to determine whether or not your standard of living is adequate is how secure is your legal tenure? Is it a lease? Is it ownership? What is the system around that? And what is the system that protects against arbitrary termination of those things? Are there services and materials, facilities and infrastructure available? What does the housing market look like? Is there good quality housing being built? Are they affordable? Is the social housing being built, or just the general housing being prepared by private sector is it good quality? Is it habitable? How far are these houses being built? Are these, or are these shelters being set up? Where exactly are they? Are they in good locations? Is it culturally adequate? Is everything there? Because, it will vary across, cultures and societies. Certain rooms, a prayer room might be necessary in a home. Maybe there needs to be a hearth, just based on the cultural realities that will shape whether or not somebody chooses to live there. Window space, those kinds of things. So when the government is building any type of social housing, are they taking these things into consideration, or are they just giving you something because you're poor and you just take anything? So those are the ways in which we assess whether or not there's an adequate standard of living that's being provided for. Obviously, tied into things like clothing, the provision of clothing and food. So food safety, food security, all of those things are engaged when we think about this right that people have. And then the last one is equality and non-discrimination. But as I had said earlier, the caveat here is that when we talk about equality and non-discrimination, we're talking about your ability to access these rights in a way that is equitable and equal, and you don't face discrimination. So it's not a freestanding freedom from equality and non-discrimination. That is in the civil and political rights realm. This one is equality and non-discrimination in relation to the other rights that we've discussed. Mind you, there are other economic, social, and cultural rights that I have not talked about, like the right to participate in cultural life. That's recognized in the treaty. I was just pulling out a lot of the ones that are most pertinent to queer people. It's important to understand that the right to equality is broader than the right to non-discrimination. Non-discrimination just speaks to you should not be discriminated against by the government. Equality speaks to the provision by the government of a set of circumstances that is equal. So it's not just them not treating you poorly, it's them putting things in place. So for example, let's go back to the hospital. Let's say there are 2 hospitals in Grenada. I'm using that randomly, I don't know the circumstances, but let's just say that. And in the north part of the island, the hospital is lovely, it is beautiful, it has all the necessary equipment, and apparently the richer communities are surrounding there. And then in the south part of the island, it's really just a clinic that is overcrowded, that barely have anybody there, that don't have enough equipment, the bathroom facilities are terrible. Then that's a conversation about equality as well. There's a little bit of discrimination potentially there, but a part of conversations about equality is recognizing that the government had a duty to provide health facilities that are adequate in both spaces. So maybe you didn't need all of this equipment over this one facility and you could have brought some there. So how resources are distributed are equality conversation versus a non-discrimination, which could just be no women are allowed at a certain facility, or the facility just doesn't even provide for women's sexual and reproductive health at all. That's just clear, discrimination. But so equality is broader in terms of making sure you're providing services that allow people to match each other where they are. So discrimination means any distinction, exclusion, or restriction that is or differential treatment that is directly or indirectly based on the prohibited grounds of discrimination. And so when people treat you differently for a specific reason, your membership in a particular group, and the impact is that it affects your rights being recognized, enjoyed, or exercised on equal footing. So there are different types of equality. You have formal equality, which is where there's a law and policy that says everybody's equal. But when we talk about substantive equality, we're talking about equality of outcomes. So it's not enough to prohibit discrimination or say everybody's equal in healthcare. It's about looking at the lived realities. Yes, you are providing these services, you're providing health services, but are you taking into account the realities of women, of queer people, of trans people, of persons with disabilities? Yes, you provide the hospital, but is there a ramp? Right? Yes, you provide a hospital, but the cancer care unit is upstairs and there's no elevator, for example. So those are the types of things. Or yes, you provide a hospital, but there's no one there that is trained in sign language, and so this person who is deaf has no means of communicating what is wrong, what is ailing them. And so those are the types of conversations when we talk about equality and non-discrimination within the sphere of economic, social, and cultural rights. They provided social housing for persons with disabilities, and it is not equipped. The bathroom settings are the toilet is too high, you know, those types of things. Or you put it all the way up a hill. I know that's a challenge for certain people to be able to access that without a vehicle, those kinds of things. And of course, there are different forms of discrimination. There's direct, so explicit differential treatment. So no women allowed, no girls allowed in school. Indirect discrimination, policies that appear neutral but have differential impact. So for example, if you punish children or deny children education if they get pregnant in school or, you know, reproduce while in school, obviously that might be neutral, but that mostly affects the girl because she's the one that shows pregnancy and not the boy. And then there's systematic discrimination that can be pervasive and deeply entrenched in social behavior. So programs like nursing programs that only give scholarships to girls and not boys, for example, based on this understanding that it's mostly women that become nurses. So, you know, those are different levels at which these things can occur. And Article 2 of the covenant shows like the different grounds for that are prohibited, but no, the other status, that's where we come in as queer people. And TUNED in Australia, this communication did say sex includes sexual orientation, but both of those mean that this covenant applies to us as well. So before I move to the Caribbean realities, I wanted to have a conversation. I wanted to once again open for any questions. I know I talked about a bunch of rights. Or do we have any questions?
Yes, I do. Now, Sharon alluded to the idea of operationalizing rights. My question to you is, what does that look like in states' economic planning, in policy planning, with regards to developing national strategic plans for things like climate change, HIV, housing, health? What does that look like in its in operationalizing rights for marginalized population more broadly and LGBT population more specifically?
And you want me to answer it or Sharon?
No, I want you to answer it. You're the person talking.
No, I just wanted to clarify because you said Sharon raised it, so I wanted to make sure that whether or not you wanted. But I think when we talk about operationalizing these rights, particularly if we're talking about what we're talking about in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, I think the best way to operate, and what I've seen work to the extent that it does work in Jamaica, is the meaningful inclusion of representatives from these marginalized groups. Because the truth is, the state generally just does not know or has not tried to know or understand the realities of our communities, specifically the LGBT community, but other communities as well. And so if we are not in the room explaining why the policies don't make sense, the research approaches do not work or will not get the necessary data, if we're not saying you also need to consider this as well, when you're training these persons, you need to put this in the training curricula. If we're not a part of those conversations, then, and that's the one step, if we're not a part of those conversations, it's going to be difficult for whatever program is then produced to really cater to our realities. And then the other part of that is that we also need to be involved in the implementation, training programs, policy reviews, oversight mechanisms. We need to be involved there. And we also need to be, as communities, doing our own assessments and monitoring of those programs as they come out. We need to be funneling our community members. So for example, whenever there were like any type of hurricane relief or COVID relief programs, we send them to community members so that they can benefit as well. And also then we ask them what was their experience. so that we can document that for future whenever if we're in a consultation or we're meeting with a minister or a policymaker. So I think those are the ways that you truly get it operationalized. Unfortunately, we're just gonna have to keep our feet on their necks. We have to try it as best as possible, if not ourselves, our allies getting in the rooms where the program is being developed. And even when it is developed, because they will listen to you and then not put what you've recommended either at all or only in part. It is then for you to do that monitoring and show what the consequences are of not taking everything into account, what kind of poor outcomes that then leads to. I think all of that then is what will impact whether or not those programs that are rolled out meet our needs. But it's also understanding what the standards should be from our end. We need to know what our own community's needs are, because we oftentimes presume that we know our communities deeply, and oftentimes we don't. So making sure that as organizers, we're doing community consultations, we're keeping them informed, getting that, using that as the basis for our engagements, and coming back to community and empowering them to do their own monitoring and feed it back. So it's this constant loop of getting involved at the start, getting involved in the middle and at the end, until we see a program that works for us.
I believe your comments have focused on the short term and intermediary term with regards to results.
Sure.
But you're suggesting that we're struggling with the long-term outcomes to ensure those things are mainstream. Sharon, by the way, just said she was wheeling her suitcase and she missed my question. I have no idea if she would be able to add in her 2 cents now, but I thought I would mention it. I'm moving on.
Right. But I will just say to your broader point about the long term, I think the long term answer is getting the policy changes that we want, but we still have to monitor those, right? And getting the policy changes using some of the avenues that I'd already shared about, the dialogues, the lobbying, the engaging with our diplomats and our other stakeholders to get the policy to shape. Because you want in the long term that system to be transformed in a meaningful way. And having seen what at least we've tried to do with the police here in Jamaica, to some level of success, not completely. Yes, the training institution now trains them on the diversity policy. Yes, they do engage us to be a part of those trainings, but it's still not enough. We still have to train. We still have to train community about the policy. We still have to tell them what the policy means and where they can go in case it's not implemented, and feed that back. We still have to do research on whether or not it's being implemented. And so I think the long term is the policy change, but the cultural change is in those short bursts, and keep on correcting it until those two align. The policy intent matches the reality on the ground. I think that's kind of also where I was coming from. But that only works if we become ensconced in that system. If we really become so enmeshed in the system that we are engaged as a matter of course. And so I think that is what gets us both short, medium, and long term.
I'm with you on that. On my end, it becomes a very interesting point as to how organizations are able to reconcile what their priorities are in the short and intermediary term versus the long-term outcomes that are necessary for transformation and change. This is not your area. You're speaking to law, but I'm just making an observation, and I'm done here.
Okay. It's not my area, but any other questions before I go to the last part of this conversation? All right. So I wanted us to talk about whether, because of this conversation actually that Caleb raised about how do we navigate these lofty human rights ideals and the realities that as we have them on the ground, right, in our Caribbean countries. And so I looked at the constitutions as we have them to ask, well, are our rights guaranteed? Because there's a difference between having the programs that our governments have, and some of our governments have quite a few social programs, but nothing actually requires them to have them from a legal standpoint. Some of them are backed by laws, so there is poor relief legislation in some of our countries, but nothing really forces them to keep these social programs beyond their general belief in the rights, assuming that is there because they ratified the treaties. Nothing in our constitutions allow us to challenge when they fail. Very famously, the right to housing is protected in the South African Constitution, and there was a case that challenged the lack of development of a certain community. And it took years and years for the positive decision to be realized. So there's some critiques to be made of whether or not putting these in the Constitution has meaningful impact. But I think it's also relevant to understand whether or not, our governments have gone this far in recognizing certain rights. And so on a review of the Constitution, Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados did not guarantee any of the ESCRs. Belize does have a right to work in Section 15 of their Constitution. Dominica and Grenada also don't guarantee any of that. Guyana, and this is interesting about Guyana. So Guyana has principles for interpreting and framing that are at the basis of their governance. And so within those principles in Section 22 to 27, there is the right to work, leisure, social security, health, education, and housing. And those rights these are principles. They're not necessarily just justiciable rights, but I do think it's relevant that they at least put these in the principles. However, health, education, and a healthy environment is separately protected in parts of Section 149. In A, H, and J are protected as rights. And so it's interesting that Guyana creates that division. And I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the big scale constitutional reform that they had done in the 80s. That to kind of also make them closer to like a socialist republic. And Jamaica does have two rights recognized. So the right to education, and it's the right to a pre-primary and primary education free of charge. That is recognized. And then there's a right to a healthy and productive environment. And so using this to point out that environmental rights don't necessarily formally exists in the international human rights law framework. It does exist in the environmental law treaties, and there are a couple of environmental law treaties that create obligations on the state to do environmental protection. But whether or not there is this actionable right of individuals and peoples has not necessarily translated throughout international human rights law. What has translated, though, is the fact that if you don't protect the environment, there might be poor health outcomes. So it then becomes a part of the right to health, and maybe it becomes a part of the right to an adequate standard of living. However, here in Jamaica, we do recognize a separate right to a healthy environment. Has not been, well, there was a successful case recently that I have not gotten the chance to review. So it is there. And there's a lot of potential for what that means. And so, yeah. In St. Kitts and Nevis, that's not guaranteed either. In St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Trinidad and Tobago, none of the economic, social, and cultural rights are guaranteed. Most of these, with the exception of St. Lucia, that doesn't even recognize the treaty at all. I mean, your options there in terms of how do you move forward, my view would be pushing for some level of ratification or pushing for constitutional reform that puts one or two of the rights in, because you don't need the treaty for your government to recognize the right, to be honest. But in these other countries, even though the rights aren't recognized in your constitution, I still think there's enough within the international human rights law framework, whether it is through the UPR findings or the treaty body review that might come up with recommendations that you can use to ground advocacy. But that is the reality. We do have, our countries have, by and large, recognized these rights internationally. Most of them have not translated too much locally, with the exception of Guyana that has a broad scale set of principles, and of course, the minor exceptions in Belize and Jamaica. Now, the broader discussions that I want to open, hold up, I think I saw, yeah, go back. I pressed the wrong buttons because I was, that is what I was trying to find, the chat. Yeah, the broader discussion that I want to open is, now that we know these rights exist, and we know that our countries only scantily recognize them, what does it mean for our realities across the region? And I would like to invite persons to kind of share, whether it is around housing, education, workplace environment, social security, what are the realities that queer people are facing, that therefore this kind of human rights reality raises kind of additional concerns. So I'm opening the floor to hear what are some of the relevant experiences wherever you're from around some of these issues, so that we can understand and begin to think about what the next steps are as it relates to securing or recognizing economic, social, and cultural rights. So opening the floor now for opinions and questions. Hello, hello. I was inviting feedback and conversation.
Looks like you're not going to get any.
Okay, sure. I'll flag a few issues, and then I'll open up for broader questions or hand back over to Dominique. But so some of the, what have I done? Anyways, what I was gonna say is that in my context, one of the major issues is displacement. 1 in 3 LGBTQ plus Jamaicans have been displaced at some point in their lives, which is a ridiculous statistic. And unfortunately, well, now we have about 3, but there are about 3 LGBTQ specific shelters in the country. The main one is the Lara Chang Foundation. The other 2, one is specific to transmasculine people or trans people specifically. And then there is the other one that's mostly for people who are on their way out of Jamaica via asylum processes that are underway. And so for me, the reality that housing insecurity is so real, I am particularly perturbed by the lack of recognition of the right to housing. There is the reality that that people do, the law as it stands does allow for people to be evicted from their properties on the basis of on moral grounds. So a landlord can reasonably evict you for moral reasons, or if you are considered a nuisance, but the law don't define what nuisance means. And so that is an ongoing reality. Obviously, in our context, we've done advocacy to have those provisions removed from the Rent Restriction Act, but that's an ongoing reality. And I'm also concerned that there just aren't enough shelters in this country. And it's an ongoing situation that we as an organization have had to navigate with the different government bodies. Currently, now we do have a representative on one of on the homelessness committee within the municipal corporation within the Kingston and St. Andrew. So that's something that we're navigating and we're trying to address. But the fact that there's nothing that adequately protects people who are displaced is a very real consequence. And then the other part of it is we don't have laws really that prohibit discrimination in the workplace. Some countries have some version of it. We really don't. At best, we have unfair dismissal as a tool. So if you're unfairly dismissed, you can make a report to the Industrial Disputes Tribunal, and maybe you'll be protected. Unfair dismissal cases are broad, and so even though they don't specifically relate to LGBTQ identity, there is an opportunity there that you can say, well, I shouldn't have been dismissed because of this. And some of that has been pursued locally. But those are some of like the real realities. The housing and the education pieces. I've talked a bit already about my personal issue with the lack of social security. And then the last thing I'll mention, because I see a hand up, is healthcare. Trans healthcare is not a reality. Well, publicly supported trans healthcare. Trans people now in Jamaica are getting some level of access to hormone replacement therapy, but it is about who has access to resources. It's about who can afford it, which means that their ability to truly have the highest attainable standard of healthcare is limited because that service is just not publicly available. But yes, go ahead. I'm assuming that's Joshua.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Glenroy. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I really think that this is a very important area that needs to be explored a bit more. And I also think, as you were saying, it's an entry point. I think for us to do various forms of advocacy, because while saying something like freedom of speech and right to liberty might not be understandable to the common person, like for the most part, talking about things like health, like education, because everybody need healthcare, people need to eat, people need to work. I think that sometimes this might be a bit more relatable to common folk in society. And I feel like if it's an entry point, especially in our English independent speaking Caribbean, because we've seen some recent developments, at least based on the areas you've mentioned, at least in the area of employment. Like we've seen how St. Lucia and Barbados, through their various employment legislation, have at least start to protect persons from discrimination or unfair dismissal based on this specific act or country in relation to employment. Because we recognize that it's a serious issue, at least in those countries, they recognize that it's a serious issue that, if by chance persons can't even work, then it really impacts many of their other rights and just them being able to live a proper standard of living. So I definitely think that this area of economic, social, and cultural rights is definitely an entry point, and also because of all the chatter and talk now about, our state surrounding climate change and climate resilience and climate financing. I know you touched briefly on the whole issue of environmental rights and if they exist and how and so forth. I think that that's also a good entry point because a lot of our countries are so focused on the issue of climate change and us being protected. Like even now, I'm still in Panama. Even at the OS General Assembly, a lot of states in their speeches mm, talked about the importance of um, addressing the issue of climate change and states accessing climate financing. And we know that that's an intersectional issue that, yes, impacts LGBTQIA plus persons and in some ways disproportionately, but also it affects, the wider society as we are seeing in this region in St. Vincent, Jamaica, we've etc. We've had a lot of various devastating hurricanes. It seems yearly now, at least one country seems to get a huge hurricane. Let's hope, this is a good year. But there are definitely entry points because I think maybe our governments and just the common folk can sometimes relate a bit more to some of these concepts than the bigger, sometimes concepts that maybe seem, maybe, yeah. So that's just what I want to say is that I think that these are great entry points, especially based on recent developments, especially in the area of employment in the region.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joshua. I see a couple comments in the chat, so I'll go respond to them and then I'll bring in Caleb. So Joshua asked, how can schools and universities contribute to reducing the systemic discrimination that often leads to poor health unemployment and housing instability for LGBTQIA plus people. I think they can do that in twofold. One of the ways that they can do is to incorporate the realities and experiences of LGBT people in their education. So one thing I'm proud that we were able to do is work with the clinical psychology program up at the University of the West Indies, Mona, to incorporate the issues of LGBT people in how they train their clinical psychologists so that when they're providing mental health services, they're more equipped, they have better information. So they adjusted their curricula to do that. So I think that's one of those ways. And these institutions have to start adjusting their curricula so that our needs and our realities can be recognized and so people can be prepared to provide us services without discrimination, understanding the impact that that has broadly, not just on us, but on national development when we are treated unfairly. I think, yeah, there's a lot of educating and cultural shift work that schools can do. And also, begin, and as universities can create standards and develop thinking around the standards for how sectors operate. And I think that those are spaces that can happen. I will say that I do, so for example, led by you in Jamaica, but also I know it's a regional conference, the Beyond Homophobia conference that has happened 3 or 4 times now, is a space where a lot of those conversations happen. The last time it was held was 2020, I want to say 4 or 5. It's probably 2025. Yes, it was. No, it wasn't. It was 2024. But yes, or was it 5? Either way, the point is, that's a space where that can happen, and a university facilitating that dialogue is critical. You also asked in Jamaica what legal protections currently exist for LGBTQIA plus people who are forced to leave their homes because of discrimination, family rejection, or violence. Not much. So technically, the Child Care and Protection Act criminalizes parents who abandon their children. So technically that exists. Most people don't use that. I don't think you should use that. I mean, a criminal sanction for a parent that displaces you doesn't inure to your benefit. But outside of that, there's very little. If there's violence involved, obviously you can report it to the police and there might be a lawsuit that you can do. Most people don't have the time or resources, are very terrified of doing that. So the legal protections I don't think are satisfactory. I think what we do need, not just in Jamaica, but across the region, are comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation like they're pursuing in Belize with the Equal Opportunities Bill that we hope will be very soon tabled in Parliament. And so Risha, as a Vincentian, Aricia, as a Vincentian living abroad, what can we do to help move our country forward with respect to LGBTQ rights? I think the diaspora plays a significant role in moving things forward. I think one of those roles is supporting local movements through financing, and you don't have to directly finance, you can fundraise for local movements. Actually, a big shout out to the Jamaican diaspora, who some members really did fundraise and help us with our Hurricane Melissa relief program that we had. So that's one thing that you can do. You can raise awareness in the different spaces that you are about the realities, make linkages that organizations locally and communities locally can benefit from, or you can move back and be one of the many voices pushing for change. The history of the movement in Jamaica is that Jamaicans went abroad for a period of time. They came back and they decided they were not going to stay in the closet. And I do think people who live in the diaspora, having had the benefit of living outside of the region, you can come back with a certain energy and legitimacy that can push movements forward. So yes, you can send resources from where you are, support people from where you are, but you can also come back and join the push with a different level of legitimacy and protection sometimes. Sharon said it's also important to raise awareness and educate our people on these topics because over time, because of the lack of denial of rights, we've adapted and need to be reminded as citizens that we do have rights. That is so true. Caribbean people, we oftentimes just go along with the flow. And yeah, these reminders are important. That's why I'm very happy that IRO is integrating this and has always kind of integrated these conversations as part of their Pride celebrations. And then Okay. Well, I do believe, so Joshua said he doubts that, inclusivity will happen in our lifetime. I guess it depends on the degree of inclusivity. I think, I think steps have been made in my lifetime that have, to me, have been shocking. If we think about the decriminalization wave that has happened from 2016 to now, that's 10 years, dramatic shifts have happened across this region. There have been positive and favorable law reform. In St. Lucia, their domestic violence legislation is inclusive. So inclusivity is possible with continued advocacy, activism, pushing, visibility, all of the works. I think it's important that we recognize that we are capable of making change because we have made change in this region, both not only on the legal front, but culturally. And so I think I'm hopeful because of what I've seen that the generation coming up will continue us on that trajectory. And thank you for bringing up that point, Maria, about focusing on the intersectional nature. I do think that economic, social, and cultural rights provide us an opportunity to build coalitions because we're not the only ones as queer people who are affected by these things. A lot of people are affected by homelessness and joblessness and unfair treatment in education, terrible healthcare services. We can build those kinds of coalitions and it also gives us a local legitimacy because if we're talking about these issues and we're pushing for these issues in a way that it will benefit everyone, of course, we're going to integrate our needs as well. Then it becomes less about decriminalization and the sex that we want to have and the marriage that we want to have, but really it becomes about the fact that we just want basic treatment as citizens. So I do think that, it's an opportunity for coalition building. It's an opportunity to take on issues that, affect others and they can take on ours. I do think the economic, social, and cultural rights bits, oftentimes not a lot of people pay attention to them, but so many people are affected by them. They do provide an opportunity for broader engagement and coalition building. Right. So Caleb, you did have a point. I just wanted to go through the others.
No, it's important for you to have covered the rest before you get to me. But with that said, I like how you presented the values of the conventions or the covenants in ideal ways. Unfortunately, it's still our burden to demand its enforcement, to pull up a chair and take a seat at the table. It's still our burden to speak up when violations occur. And while the decriminalization process on 2016 onward have helped to shift cultural psychology with regards to our rights, the egregores or the thought farm, which says we must know our place, still continues in a common sense way. For me, the work of dismantling misogyny, homophobia, implicit, explicit bias, qualitative repressive practices are part of an ecosystem that still has to be completed. We've reached a threshold, if you will, with decriminalization, but there's a plateau that needs to take place to then complete the loop in the transformation of our ecosystem. With that said, it's also clear to me that we have struggled to advance our civil rights, but not recognize that even if you get your rights without the ability to eat still remains a struggle. And as such, we need to insert ourselves in economic anti-poverty, uh, climate change issues in order to ensure that our economic independence or our vulnerability to poverty is not ignored in the wider discussion of benefiting from legislative reform, which threaten our access to benefits like Social Security, like government pension, and the like. In any case, I will note Joshua's point. I've been doing this for over 18 years, and while there's a psychological shift, the burden of systemic shift will continue for a generation. So we won't see all the changes, but we will see some changes, and that, in my mind, allows us to continue to work with tenacity. I close there.
Thank you so much for that. You made some very valid points. And the one thing that I will add, yes, important to document history, valid point there. The one thing that I will add is that as we think about how we work intersectionally and broadly, I think it's important as queer people and as queer advocates that we really take time to understand how we show up in coalitions that don't center us. I think our movements, we're used to a movement that centers us, and that's valid. But I think being in coalitions where we are not at the center, but are still able to kind of respectfully and carefully integrate our issues is a skill that I think we all are going to have to learn, especially as our movements change and grow and as our priorities change and grow. Knowing how to show up alongside our partners is critical. So that is where I will end it. Thank you so much for those that participated and asked questions and raised points and for listening. I will hand it back over to Dominique, I think, for any closeout. And let me stop sharing. Or is it Joshua?
Hi, good night again, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I'm just going to hand over to our president, Joshua Bardu, to give the vote of thanks.
Good night, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our webinar on the economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights of LGBTQI plus persons in the Caribbean. I think this is a very timely and necessary discussion as we, move forward to advocate and promote human rights across our Caribbean countries. Many of us here are from various countries with different contexts. I want to thank, first of all, Laws Without Borders Canada for making this webinar possible and for being able to contribute to Pride SPG 2026 and for our other donors and funders for Pride SPG 2026 this year. This is our final event, a webinar. Every year we try to have at least one in case persons who can't join us in country want to just join us online for an activity. So we do appreciate our generous donors and funders for their continued support. I also want to thank, most of all, our excellent facilitator tonight, Glenroy Murray. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this webinar for us tonight. We truly appreciate it, and I'm sure, as usual, we are all fed by your wisdom and your knowledge and your experience. We appreciate you breaking down the concepts for us. Before you went into the meat of the matter, you let us know what are human rights and so forth, for those of us who maybe are not familiar with these concepts. And we thank you so much for talking about the various classes of rights. Oftentimes when we talk about human rights, so often, we focus on right to life or freedom of expression and so forth. But which, as you said, are civil and political rights. But it's good that we can focus as well, specifically on the whole issue of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. And you went through a number of rights with us: right to health, right to work, right to social security, right to adequate standard of living. And I liked how you connected everything to, the right to equality and non-discrimination, which are separate rights. And you looked at how, these rights are enshrined in international norms and also in our local legislation or laws across the Caribbean region. As we continue to promote and advocate for human rights, let us continue to work together and let us continue to be positive and optimistic. Sometimes I know it's bleak. As somebody was wondering if anything would happen in our lifetime, but as persons in the chat or tonight have noted, some significant gains have taken place. Some things that persons thought were impossible maybe 10 or 20 years ago. But that is only possible because as activists, and as advocates, as lawyers, whatever role that we're playing within this community, whether it's also in the diaspora or locally in our countries, that's because we're working. We're working to create the change that we want to see in our various social and legal contexts. So thank you so much again. Murray, I wouldn't bore you out with my long speech and closing. So happy Pride to everyone. I know some persons here are celebrating Pride later on in the year, but in SVG currently at least we do it in June. So happy Pride to everybody, and I wish you all the best. Have a good night, and let's continue to promote human rights and continue with the good fight in our various contexts. Thank you so much again, Glenroy. We appreciate it. Good night, everyone,
Good night. Thank you for having me.
and all the best. Bye.